episode 60 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are running away to join the circus, a prospect that seems more and more appealing with every passing day. First up, we have the highly controversial Freaks from 1932, directed by Tod Browning. This stars Olga Baclanova, Harry Earles, Daisy Earles, Wallace Ford, Leila Hyams, and Henry Victor. Then we follow this with the incredibly surreal Santa Sangre from 1989, directed by Alejandro Jodorowsky. This stars Axel Jodorowsky, Adan Jodorowsky, Blanca Guerra, Thelma Tixou, and Guy Stockwell. Along the way, we'll be discussing the life and careers of directors Tod Browning and Alejandro Jodorowsky, the history of the quote-unquote freak show, the careers of Harry and Daisy Earles, and much, much more. But before we do any of that though, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used in preparing this week's episode, and as always, all sources will be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing Freaks, I have heavily referenced the book Dark Carnival, The Secret World of Tod Browning, Hollywood's Master of the Macabre, by David J. Scull and Elias Savada. I've also referred to the books Tod Browning's Dracula, written by Gary D. Rhodes, Freaks, a film by Tod Browning, written by Jack Hunter, and American Gothic, 6 Decades of Classic Horror Cinema by Jonathan Rigby. I've also referred to interviews and extras on the Blu-ray release of the film from Criterion. And when discussing Santa Sangre, I have referred to the books Anarchy and Alchemy, the films of Alejandro Jodorowsky by Ben Cobb, The 7 Lives of Alejandro Jodorowsky, compiled and curated by Vincent Bernier and Nicholas Tellop, and interviews, extras, and commentaries on the Blu-ray special edition of the film from Severin. And just before we continue, a quick content warning. The film Freaks was, and still is, highly controversial, not least in the language used in the film, which of course reflected the sensibilities of the time. When covering this film, I will, as always, be quoting from records, interviews, and recollections of the day, and because I want to portray these as accurately as possible, I've decided that I'm not going to change or soften anything. So please be aware that some of the language used in this episode will doubtless be offensive. There is no offence meant on my part, but I do think it's important to accurately reflect the sensibilities of the time, even though I certainly don't agree with them. A few weeks ago, when we covered the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I mentioned that the rather murky recollections of some of the people involved made separating fact from fiction rather challenging. And we find ourselves in a somewhat similar position today with Tod Browning. Not so much in relation to his film work, but certainly in relation to his early life, which, it is fair to say, he exaggerated ever so slightly for dramatic effect. So, while I'm going to do my best to separate fact from fiction where possible, please do bear in mind that Mr. Browning was a master of hyperbole with a keen sense of dramatic flair, and so a few things are probably going to slip through. Tod Browning was born Charles Albert Browning in Louisville, Kentucky on the 12th of July 1880, although, here we go, he would later claim that his date of birth was 1874, and that when he first arrived in Hollywood, he lied about his age to appear younger. Sounds believable enough, and it wouldn't be the first or last time someone did that. But all records indicate that 1880 is in fact the correct year, not least a birth certificate that he himself filed in 1947. And this is just the first of many such confabulations that are heading your way. We don't even know when he adopted the name of Tod, or whether it was a family nickname or one that he chose himself. As it's spelled with one D, there are those who claim it was chosen because it is the German word for death, though I couldn't find much credible information to support that. But although, as our story begins, we don't think he had yet adopted the name, to avoid any confusion with other members of his family, I'm going to call him Tod for just the first few moments. So the young Tod was brought up in a middle-class household. His father Charles was a bricklayer, carpenter and machinist, and his uncle Pete was a legendary baseball star, nicknamed the Gladiator or the Louisville Slugger. And that's a name that I've heard of even over here in the UK. Uncle Pete was, by all accounts, a very loud and rebellious figure, and he lived just 4 houses away. And so, although we don't know much at all about Todd's interactions with him, you can imagine that having such a figure as a close relative must have had some impact. First of all, it is certain that Tod developed a lifelong love of baseball, but it would also seem that he might have inherited at least 2 of Uncle Pete's other personality traits as well. The first of these was showmanship, which Tod clearly had from a very young age. At just 7, he was charging the neighbourhood children for shows that he staged in an old shed behind the family home. I don't have much information about their content, but they were clearly very popular. Later, the local paper, the Herald Post, would write about them, highlighting Tod's role as director, performer, and master of ceremonies. Calling him precocious and a go-getter, he was compared favourably to P.T. Barnum, the greatest showman on earth, someone we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. The paper then went on to call Tod, quote, as bright as a dime and keenly alert to the main chance. That was why Tod Browning's penny shows always drew better crowds than the rival penny shows in the neighbourhood. He put on something better. He knew his public and studied their wants and gave them what they wanted. End quote. Perhaps some of this came from his Uncle Pete, and perhaps some came from his environment. As his biographers David J. Scal and Elias Savada point out, Louisville was linked to New Orleans by the Ohio River and the Mississippi, and was also home to the carnivalesque atmosphere commonly associated with the French Quarter. It had an active and exciting riverfront culture with playhouses that staged melodrama and burlesque, and was also often visited by touring companies from New York and Europe, as well as, very importantly, the carnival. We don't have much information at all about Tod's education, aside from the fact that he was still in school at the age of 9. No records exist at all after that, which may be because he dropped out soon after, or possibly because the records were all destroyed by a tornado that decimated the neighbourhood at around the same time. In any case, the success of his penny performances and the theatrical atmosphere of his hometown was stirring something within him that would not be easily satisfied by a high school education, and so he began to make plans to escape. And this is where we might begin to struggle to separate reality from fantasy. As his biographers put it, most of the claims about his early career cannot be confirmed by any documentary evidence, and are, quote, likely an uneasy amalgam of truth, half-truth, embellishment, and in some cases, outright fabrication. End quote. So, with all of that in mind, here we go. So, what we do know is that Tod did indeed leave home to join the circus, or perhaps more accurately, a travelling carnival. That being said, we can't really be sure at what age this actually happened. According to him, it was when he was aged 12, though later stories published after he made it in Hollywood put him at the age of 18. According to that story, in 1898 a state fair came to Louisville and Tod fell in love with one of the dancers, and so when the show left town, so did he. Apparently, when his parents next heard from him, he was working in the carnival as a ballyhoo artist, also known as a spieler or barker. And this was the person whose job it was, and I assume still is, to drum up interest in the various carnival attractions. So not that dissimilar to the very first character that we see in 1932's Freaks. And it would appear that these similarities do not end there. According to the previously mentioned article in the Herald Post, at one point Tod was a barker for an act known as the Wild Man of Borneo. This was in fact an African-American performer dressed in a costume, but presented as some kind of evolutionary curiosity. Unfortunately, this was far from unusual at the time, with acts such as this, as well as people who were physically different or disabled, often exhibited as quote-unquote missing links. This then was an example of what was called a freak show, and again, this is not my terminology, but the terminology by which these shows were promoted at the time. Although their popularity peaked in the 19th century, their origins can be traced back to the medieval period, when taverns and country fairs would exhibit people with differences for crowds to gawp at. And this was not just restricted to the poor and the uneducated. Royal courts would often display quote-unquote wonders of nature, which encompassed people with physical conditions and disabilities, exotic animals, and enslaved people from lands that were being discovered and conquered by European explorers. So there we go. History proving once again that our predecessors were really not very good people. In some cases, appearing in such exhibits was enforced through slavery, and in others, it was the only way that people could earn a living, regardless of how dehumanizing it might have been. One early example of this is a pair of Italian conjoined twins called Lazarus and Johannes Colloredo. They toured Europe until they became exhibits at the court of King Charles I, who ruled England, Scotland and Ireland from 1625 to 1649. But it was really in the 19th century that such quote-unquote exhibits became a lucrative enterprise. In 1810, a woman called Sarah Bartman, a member of the Kyoko people of what is now the Eastern Cape of South Africa, was brought to England, where she was exhibited under the name the Hottentot Venus. Bartman was perceived as a curiosity because of steatopygia, a genetic condition which causes large fatty deposits to collect on the upper legs and the buttocks. The man who brought her to Europe, a doctor called Alexander Dunlop, knew that her appearance would seem highly unusual to European eyes, and this was something he was very keen to exploit. And so, once they arrived, he began to market her as the, quote, missing link between man and beast, end quote. What a charmer. This exhibition, which came just a few years after the abolition of slavery in the UK, caused outrage, and newspaper campaigns were mounted for Sarah's release. Eventually, the case went to court, where the Attorney General produced two affidavits, one which detailed how Dunlop described Sarah as if she were his property, and another which described the degrading conditions under which she was exhibited, and which also gave evidence of coercion. Sarah was questioned before an attorney where she spoke Dutch, in which she was fluent, and in a 3-hour testimony, she reportedly said that she had agreed of her own free will to come to England for 6 years, and that she was under no restraint. Whether she was really in England of her own free will, whether there was coercion, or whether she had simply been tricked somehow, we do not know. Personally, my opinion is that this is a woman who was trafficked, and I'm sure that there would have been consequences had she said anything otherwise. But on this evidence, the case was dismissed, and she disappeared from the public gaze, in London anyway. Dunlop and she toured other parts of England, and we also know that she was exhibited, God, I hate using that word, at a fair in Limerick, Ireland, in 1812. In 1814, a man called Henry Taylor took her to France and then sold her to a man called Jean Lieu, who displayed her at the Palais Royal in Paris. She was also bought out as an exhibit at wealthy people's parties and private salons, sometimes with a collar and a leash around her neck. Needless to say, she saw none or very little of the money being charged for her presence, and she died on January the 1st, 1816, at the estimated age of just 26. To add insult to injury, after her death, a plaster cast was made of her body, her skeleton was removed, and her brain and genitalia were pickled and displayed in bottles at a museum in Paris. So, once again, not good people. Another example, this time from the States, are Millie and Christine McCoy, conjoined twins born into slavery in 1852. At the age of just 10 months, they were sold by their enslaver to a Carolina showman for $1,000, and then spent many of their formative years as quote-unquote freaks of nature at state fairs across the Deep South. Their story, though, does have a happier ending than Sarah's. At age 6, they were reunited with their mother and began to receive a formal education, learning to read and write and studying music and dance, eventually becoming fluent in 5 languages. After the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 ended their status as enslaved people, they continued to perform professionally throughout North America and Europe as entertainers, performing as an act called the Two-Headed Nightingale, under which name they were presented to Queen Victoria and also worked for P.T. Barnum. When they were in their 30s, they retired and moved back to the farm on which they had been born, which had, in the interim, been bought by their father and left to them in his will. They lived there until 1912, when, at the age of 61, they both succumbed to tuberculosis. I've mentioned P.T. Barnum a couple of times now, and it was really he who ushered in what is referred to as the golden age of the freak show, which is a rather terrible turn of phrase. It should be noted, though, that the term freak show did not originate with Barnum, but instead began to be used after his death in 1891, with Barnum himself preferring the terms living wonders or human curiosities instead. Not sure that's much better, to be honest, but there you go. Known as the greatest showman on earth, one of his early attractions was a woman called Joyce Heth, who he marketed as being 161 years old and the former nurse of George Washington. Of course, this was all nonsense, and on her death an autopsy revealed that she was just 80. But Barnum's flamboyant promotion and Heth's ability to convincingly tell stories about George Washington's childhood kept the act popular for years. And then, in 1841, Barnum purchased a building called Scudder's American Museum in New York City, and after converting the exterior and renaming it Barnum's American Museum, it reopened for business in 1842. The original museum had exhibited a stuffed American bison, stuffed birds, and magic lantern shows, but Barnum's was, of course, slightly different. He populated his museum with animal exhibits, including live beluga whales, yes, in the basement of a building in New York, a theatre, a flea circus, waxworks, the trunk of a tree around which Jesus and his disciples supposedly once gathered, and, of course, a freak show. No stranger to twisting the truth, as the George Washington and tree trunk stories tell us. Among his exhibits was an orangutan who he put in a dress and marketed as a missing link called Mademoiselle Fanny. There was also Hervio Nano, who had been born with a congenital leg condition, who was promoted as the quote-unquote gnome fly, Jane Campbell, who was known as the Great Connecticut Giantess, bearded ladies, people with dwarfism, gigantism, vitiligo and albinism, and people with a condition called microcephaly, which is characterized by a very small pointed head and small overall physical stature, and is often linked with mental disabilities. Perhaps his most famous act, though, was Charles Stratton, who went by the stage name of General Tom Thumb, and who was 40 inches or 1 meter tall. He first began working for Barnum when he was just 5 years old, so clearly there is more than a little exploitation there, although he did go on to be celebrated around the world as a talented stage actor. Not surprisingly, the museum was a huge success. At its height, it was open for 15 hours a day and saw 15,000 visitors per day pass through its doors. Between 1842 and 1865, 38 million customers paid 25 cents admission to visit, and that's something that's quite astounding, given that the population of the US at the time was under 32 million people. As well as appearing at the museum, Barnum also took his show on the road, partnering with James Bailey to tour what they called the greatest show on earth across the US and Europe. And it was while in Europe that the Barnum and Bailey show experienced what appeared to be, initially at least, something of a well-deserved rebellion. In January 1899, 8 years after P.T. Barnum's death, the greatest show on earth was running its second winter season at London's Olympia, when the performers in the freak show staged a small revolution and threatened to go on strike. So, as you will remember, Barnum had preferred the terms living wonders or human curiosities, but after his death, freak show began to be used instead. And on the morning of January the 6th, Annie Jones, who appeared in the show as the bearded lady, called a meeting to protest at the use of the word freak. To her, the word meant something like fright, and she quite reasonably argued that if a beard made a lady a fright, then the same rule should also apply to a man. The meeting agreed and went on to approve a very forcefully worded resolution, threatening to strike if they weren't respected. Quote, "We, a majority of the living human curiosities at the Barnum and Bailey show, emphatically protest against the application of the word freak to us, and severely condemn its general assignment to those who, for their benefit or otherwise, were created differently from the human family as the latter exists today, and that, in the opinion of many, some of us really are the development of a higher type and are superior persons, inasmuch as some of us are gifted with extraordinary attributes not apparent in ordinary beings." End quote. This resolution, and the threat of a strike, soon caused a media frenzy in England, and suggestions for alternative names began to pour in from around the country. At a subsequent meeting on January the 15th, a performer called Sol Stone, known as the Lightning Calculator because he was exceptional at maths, demanded to know why the rest of the entertainers in the show were called artists, while they were all dubbed freaks. And at the end of the meeting, it was decided that one of the suggestions from the public, that of prodigies, would be a far more suitable term. The Barnum and Bailey Circus agreed, the name was changed, the rebellion was over, and that was it. For a while, at least. Because then, 4 years later, in Madison Square Garden, the word freak reared its head again, and a similar rebellion was mounted, news of which also found its way into the press. And strangely enough, the story that the US papers reported on was remarkably similar to the one in London. Yes, sadly, it turns out the whole thing was a publicity stunt, both in London and in New York. Worked like a charm then, obviously, but at the very least, it did present an impassioned plea for the recognition of the performers' humanity and their talents, which was published in the national press, both in England and the States. The success and publicity surrounding Barnum's Museum and The Greatest Show on Earth led to the freak show becoming mainstream entertainment across the US and also elsewhere, as other promoters sought to gain their share of what was by now a highly profitable venture. That there was exploitation in many there can be no doubt, with performers sometimes coerced or forced into such exhibitions against their will, and we have of course already heard 2 such examples of this. Physical differences were exaggerated for entertainment, and the shows also reinforced negative stereotypes about people who were different, perpetuating the idea that they were inferior, abnormal, and should be viewed as objects of curiosity or amusement as opposed to human beings. All of which brings us back to Tod Browning and his role as a barker for the Wild Man of Borneo Act. After this job, and according to the legend, Browning went on to work as a clown, an escape artist, a contortionist, a ringmaster, and apparently as a hypnotic living corpse, an act which was described in a magazine called Real Life in 1914. Quote, "When the celebrated hypnotist, with whom he had formed a partnership, fixed upon him his mesmeric gaze, he would fall into a trance. Then he would be lowered several feet under the ground and earth thrown over him. A wooden shaft permitted the wonder-struck crowd, one by one, to gaze down upon his inert form in the bottom of the pit, and, incidentally, also supplied him with air. Sometimes, during an exhibition, he would have to stay buried for 48 hours at a time." End quote. Perhaps not surprisingly then, Browning grew rather tired of this, and so he moved to vaudeville, where he began working as a magician's assistant. But all of this temporarily came to an end, if any of it actually happened at all, when he met and married a woman called Amy Louise Stevens in 1906. Interestingly, the newspaper announcement of his nuptials lists him as an employee of the L&N Railroad, with nary a mention of the carnival and stage work that had apparently seen him perform across Europe, the Far East and Africa. So, while we do know that he did indeed have a carnival and a theatrical background, the actual extent of it is murky, to say the least. But his job at the railroad didn't actually last very long, and soon he was back to performing in the carnival again, though this was very much to his new wife and new family's discomfort. His mother-in-law later said that she and her husband were the newlyweds' chief means of financial support, and would refer to Tod as, quote, a shiftless man who was too lazy to work. Sometimes he would work at an amusement park in the summer, but when winter would come, he didn't work. End quote. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, the marriage didn't last very long, and Tod and Louise separated in 1909. Now this makes it all sound far more formal and cordial than it actually was. When the divorce was settled a year later, in 1910, his mother-in-law declared to the court that none of them knew where he was at that point, and that it had been over a year since they had heard from him. At this point, for a while at least, Browning's story becomes ever more vague. But what we can say is that by 1911, he was playing in vaudeville in New York in a show called The Whirl of Mirth. This went on tour across the states, including a return to his hometown of Louisville in 1913. And when the tour arrived, his ex-mother-in-law filed a claim with the court, citing that Tod owed her $321 in unpaid cash loans. And just to give you an idea, that is roughly $10,000 today. Unfortunately for her, though, the tour and Browning left for an engagement in Indianapolis before any actual action could be taken. Returning to New York, his performance in The Whirl of Mirth caught the attention of a comedian called Charlie Murray. Murray was working for the Biograph Film Studios, performing in one-reel Nickelodeon comedies for a director called David Walk Griffiths, who would become far better known, if not notorious, just a few years later, under his directorial name, D.W. Griffith. Murray introduced him to Tod, and Griffith immediately hired him to appear in a pair of comedy shorts, Scenting a Terrible Crime and A Fallen Hero, both of which were released in October 1913. In 1916, Griffith left New York and relocated to California, where he became the director of the Reliance Majestic Company. Browning duly went west with him and would go on to appear in many of the films made by Reliance Majestic, most of which fell under the production umbrella of its subsidiary company, the Comic Company. So, as you can imagine, the films in which he appeared were largely comedies, with titles including An Interrupted Seance, Victims of Speed, and something called Nell's Eugenic Wedding. I mentioned earlier that Browning might well have inherited his exhibitionist nature from his uncle Pete, but unfortunately the two appear to have shared far more than that. As well as being an excellent ball player, Pete Browning also had problems with alcohol, which at one point caused him to fall asleep during the middle of a game. And if, as we now believe, addiction and alcohol dependency are partly genetic, it would appear that Tod also inherited this gene. A fellow performer would later recall that one of the reasons Tod was seen as such a good comedian was because he was daring and would take a chance with anything, something that he put down to Tod's relationship with alcohol. Quote, he never lost control of himself. He'd stay up half the night drinking and playing cards, and then come to the studio in the morning looking fresh as a daisy. He had a thing for flashy cars too. I guess that went with the whiskey. End quote. Fast cars and whiskey are of course though not a winning combination either financially or physically. As reported in a trade magazine at the time, in 1914 Tod bought a French racing car, and within his first 3 weeks of owning it, had driven it 4 times and crashed it on all 4 occasions. By now, he was not only acting, but directing, with his debut directorial effort, The Lucky Transfer, released in 1915. From here, he began to move out of comedies and into melodramas, with titles that included The Slave Girl, The Living Death, and The Burned Hand. But just as his career appeared to be taking off, an incident happened which nearly saw it come to an end. In 1916, he and some other members of the Griffith Company were drinking after hours, and among them was an up-and-coming young comedian called Elmer Booth. After a night on the drink, Browning was driving Booth and 2 other passengers home when he collided headfirst with a train car that was sitting at a railway intersection. Elmer Booth was killed on impact, and the other occupants of the car were seriously injured. Browning's right leg was fractured in 3 places below the knee, his upper body was pinned and crushed, and there were unspecified internal injuries that made his recovery, according to the San Francisco Chronicle, highly unlikely. Tod Browning did recover, but he was also never prosecuted for the accident. The coroner's verdict was that it had been caused by a lack of precaution on both parties, referring to Browning's driving and the railway conductor, despite the fact that the conductor claimed to have been waving a red signal lamp at the time of the collision. Browning would spend much time in hospital recovering from his injuries, and it seems that this took the best part of a year, some of which he spent back at home in Kentucky. He never spoke about the accident afterwards, and so we have no idea as to his thoughts on the matter or whether he felt any responsibility for Elmer Booth's untimely and tragic death. But as pointed out by his biographers, when he did return to work, first as a screenwriter and then once again as a director, his films took a sharp turn in tone, and it's possible that he was attempting to exorcise his own demons through his work. Quote, "A distinct pattern appeared in his post-accident body of work, distinguishing it from the comedy that had been a specialty before 1915. Now his focus was on moralistic melodrama, with recurrent themes of crime, culpability, and retribution." End quote. These films include his first feature as director, Jim Bludso, which was released in 1917, the same year that he married his second wife, Alice Watson. In 1919, he signed a deal with Universal, with the first film that he made there called The Wicked Darling. This was the first time that he would work with Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces, with whom he would make several movies, some of which are arguably among his best. In 1920, Browning directed a film called The Virgin of Stamboul, which was the story of an American soldier who falls in love with a beggar girl. It didn't star Lon Chaney, but it was incredibly ambitious and had a significant budget. It was also a resounding success and very well received. He followed this with a film that reunited him with Chaney called Outside the Law, again released in 1920, and this became such a success that Universal reissued it 6 years later in 1926. But the death of his father in 1922 seemed to trigger some form of collapse, or at least seems to have triggered an increase in his drinking. And although he continued to make some successful films at Universal, his career began to take a downward turn. His 1922 film Under Two Flags, while successful, was less than critically admired, and his film White Tiger, finished in the same year, went unreleased for over 12 months, reportedly because it was delivered by Browning in a fairly unreleasable state. His next film, Drifting, released in 1923, was savaged by the critics, and his reputation was not helped by the fact that he had begun an affair with his lead actress, Anna May Wong, during filming. Browning was 43 years old at the time, and Anna May was somewhere between 17 and 18. By now, he was drinking hard liquor first thing in the morning, and his wife Alice had been doing all that she could to hide the bottles left in the house. But the incident with Wong understandably proved too much, and she left him. And at the same time, Universal, also understandably, laid him off as well. He did manage to negotiate a contract with Goldwyn Pictures, but the first of these films, called The Day of Faith, was described as a sorry mess, and his contract was cut short. Hitting rock bottom, he finally decided to give up drinking. something that was recounted in a heavily sanitized article in the magazine Picture Play. According to this, one night, quote, moody, sullen and gloomy, I got out a bottle of whiskey and was just pouring a drink when it suddenly occurred to me, no wonder Alice left a weak specimen like you. End quote. He then went on to say that he threw the bottle against the radiator, said a prayer, and the next day went to Alice and asked her to take him back. This, of course, is an unbelievably sentimental and doubtless over-dramatised recollection, with no mention at all of the situation with Anna May Wong, which had actually been the final straw for Alice. Nevertheless, she took him back, just in time for him to make what would be a triumphant return to directing. This was a film called The Unholy Three, released in 1925. It would be the first of Browning's pictures with the studio MGM, and it reunited him with Lon Chaney, and also, importantly for freaks, also introduced him to an actor called Harry Earles. Focusing on a trio of criminals who meet while working at a sideshow, it features Chaney as a ventriloquist, Professor Echo, who assumes the role of a kindly little old lady and pet store owner, Mrs. O'Grady. Harry Earles, who had pituitary dwarfism, played a character called Tweedledee, who assumes a disguise as Mrs. O'Grady's baby in a pram. And then there's also Hercules, a strongman who assumes the role of a worker in the pet store. The three of them use the cover of the pet store to rob the houses of unsuspecting customers, often with no small amount of violence. One of the most famous images in the film, that of the supposed baby Tweedledee in a gangster suit and strangling a little girl, sadly ended up hitting the cutting room floor, but nevertheless the film was a huge success commercially and critically. Browning followed this with The Mystic, about a fake medium, and Dollar Down, a crime drama, both also released in 1925. He also released several more films starring Chaney, including The Blackbird and The Road to Mandalay in 1926, The Unknown, released in 1927, which also featured a very young Joan Crawford, and the now infamous London After Midnight, a vampire story, kind of, that is now considered to be one of the great lost films. It was also highly controversial. In October 1928, a year after the film was first released, a double murder trial in London saw the film used as part of the defence, with the killer saying that, before he committed the crime, he had seen a vision of Chaney in a corner, shouting and making faces at him. This very early attempt to blame the movies was happily not successful, and the killer, Robert Williams, was sentenced to death, though this was later changed to a custodial sentence. Browning and Chaney worked on three more films together: The Big City, West of Zanzibar, and Where East is East. But then their working relationship came to an end. Chaney was beginning to suffer the effects of the lung cancer that would eventually take his life in 1930, and their next intended film together, The 13th Chair, went ahead without him. A young actor by the name of Bela Lugosi was cast instead. The 13th Chair, released in 1929, was Tod Browning's first talking picture, but it was not a huge success, something that is doubtless partly due to the absence of Chaney as the leading man. Browning had also begun to drink again, though not as heavily as before. And realising that perhaps his time at MGM was up, he left the studio with no contract to go to and took an extended trip to Europe with Alice, without knowing exactly what his move would be when he returned. Fortunately for fans of horror, his next move would be to Universal, with whom he signed a 3-picture deal in 1930, and the 3 pictures he made there were Outside the Law, released in 1930, Iron Man, released in 1931, and also in 1931, Dracula. Dracula was, of course, a huge success, kickstarting the Universal Monster series that would dominate the first half of the decade. We covered the production of this in great detail a few weeks ago, so I'm not going to repeat any of that information here, but it is all there in episode 48 should you wish to go back and listen. But although it was a huge success, Dracula was bracketed by 2 financial disappointments, and Browning began to think that his time at Universal was also coming to an end. And so, in the week that Dracula was released, in fact on the very page on which it was reviewed, the LA Times announced that Browning had left Universal and signed a new contract with MGM. The early buzz around Dracula suggested that horror was going to be a profitable new area, and MGM were keen to cash in. Unfortunately for them, though, they had no idea exactly how far Browning was going to go. All of which finally brings us onto our first film of the week, which is Freaks from 1932 and directed by Tod Browning. This stars Olga Baclanova, Harry Earles, Daisy Earles, Wallace Ford, Leila Hyams, and Henry Victor. And it's also that time of the episode where we get into the spoilers, so please note that all usual warnings apply from here on in. Although MGM were keen to explore the world of horror, the first film that they offered Browning was not actually a horror film at all, but was instead a mystery called Arsène Lupin. But he wasn't at all keen on the idea. In fact, he already had his next film in mind, an adaptation of a story that had been suggested to him by the actor Harry Earles, who had played Tweedledee in The Unholy Three. The story was called Spurs by a writer called Todd Robbins, and was a revenge story set in a circus, with a central character that would have been perfect for Harry Earles to play. And given the lack of film roles for actors like Earles, one can quite easily understand why he had suggested it to Browning in the first place. The story Spurs was first published in 1923 in a publication called Munsey's Magazine, and is set in a small travelling circus in France. The main character is a performer with dwarfism called Jacques Courbet, who has fallen in love with a bareback rider, described as a tall blonde woman of the Amazon type called Jean-Marie. Jean-Marie is in love with another performer, Simon Lafleur, but when Jacques proposes marriage, she accepts, because he accompanies his proposal with the news that he has inherited a fortune. Probably not the smartest move there, mate. Quote, "She saw herself a proud lady, ruling over a country estate, and later welcoming Simon Lafleur with all of the luxuries that were so near his heart. Simon would be overjoyed to marry into a country estate. These pygmies were a puny lot. They died young. She would do nothing to hasten the end of Jacques Courbet. No, she would be kindness itself to the poor little fellow. But on the other hand, she wouldn't lose her beauty mourning for him." End quote. Perhaps Jacques would have been better off paying attention to his dog, who growls and snarls at Jean-Marie and Simon Lafleur whenever they are near. However, he ignores this and even scolds the dog for not loving Jean-Marie as much as he does. But as we all know, dogs can always tell, so you should really pay attention. He doesn't, of course, and the two do indeed get married, but at the wedding feast, which descends into an alcohol-fueled chaos, Jean-Marie drunkenly insults her new husband. She calls him a little ape and lifts him onto her shoulders, saying that she can carry him from one end of France to another. Quote, "Mr. Jacques Courbet no longer struggled. He now sat bolt upright on his bride's broad shoulder. From the flaming peaks of blind passion, he had fallen into an abyss of cold fury. His love was dead, but some quite alien emotion was rearing an evil head from its ashes." End quote. At this point, Jacques and Jean-Marie leave the wedding party and the life of the circus, she still carrying him on her shoulders. Then the story jumps forward a year, and the circus returns to town. One night, Simon Lafleur is in his lodgings when there is a knock at the door. Answering it, he sees a woman he does not recognize, a tall, gaunt woman wearing the clothes of a peasant. This, of course, turns out to be Jean-Marie, who reveals that her life has not gone the way that she had hoped. Jacques has taken her at her word, and every day forces her to carry him up and down the roads until they achieve the equivalent distance of travelling from one side of France to the other. And all the time, Jacques encourages her in her efforts by digging into her with little golden spurs. Jean-Marie and Simon conspire together that she should leave Jacques and rejoin the circus, but as they do so, Jacques arrives, along with his dog, and he stabs Simon with a very small sword. Jean-Marie is forced to return with Jacques, carrying him on her back once again, and once again motivated to quicken her pace through his use of spurs. And that is the end. Given his carnival and circus background, it is no surprise that the circus setting of the story appealed greatly to Browning. In fact, this setting had already found its way into many of his movies. We've already mentioned The Unholy Three and the fact that its gang of thieves and murderers had previously worked at a sideshow. But other examples include 1927's The Show, which is set in a travelling carnival in Budapest, and The Unknown, also released in 1927, in which Lon Chaney poses as an armless knife thrower in a circus in order to evade capture by the police, because he's also a murderer. And a year later, the film West of Zanzibar was originally to have shown Chaney working his way through Africa as a fake sideshow freak, although these scenes were eventually cut from the final release print. And this might have been just as well, as even without that scene, critics called the film repulsive, repugnant, mad, weird, and grotesque. And incidentally, Chaney's costume for the scene cut from the film crops up at the end of Freaks, so if you've seen it, you don't need me to tell you what he was meant to be playing. So the carnival setting was certainly appealing, but MGM were not entirely convinced that the story could be made into a workable film. Nevertheless, they agreed that if the story could be optioned for the screen for a reasonable fee and a more human interest element added, then they would be willing to give it the green light. Browning requested that two writers be put to work on the story, and these were Willis Goldbeck and Elliot Clausen, but the studio also appointed other writers along the way. The writing team spent a total of 5 months trying to piece the screenplay together, retaining only a couple of elements from the original story. These were the ill-fated marriage between the statuesque circus performer and a performer in the freak show, and the drunken wedding feast, which does form one of the most memorable moments in the film. The story of Freaks now centres on a character called Hans, who is a far more sympathetic character than the Jacques of the original story. As mentioned, he is played by Harry Earles, one of the stars of The Unholy Three. Earles, whose real name was Kurt Schneider, was one of 4 sibling entertainers born with pituitary dwarfism. Originally hailing from Germany, from an early age their father encouraged them to work in the entertainment business to take advantage of their stature. And so, while still in Germany, they formed an act called the Dancing Dolls, which consisted of Kurt and his sisters Hilda, Frida, and Ellie. When touring their act, they met an American agent, Bert W. Earles, and in 1916, Kurt and Frida emigrated to California, where Bert Earles became their agent. They changed their names to Harry and Gracie and began to appear on stage, debuting in the Buffalo Bill Show, where they were billed as Hansel and Gretel, the smallest dancing couple in the world. In 1920, they were joined by their sister Hilda, who changed her name to Daisy, and in 1926, the 4th sibling, Ellie, moved to California too, changing her name to Tiny. Although they took the surname Earles initially, and this is the name under which Daisy and Harry would appear in Freaks, they would eventually change it to Doll after their agent, Bert W. Earles, died in the 1930s. In 1925, Harry won the role of Tweedledee in The Unholy Three, and he also reprised the role again in a 1930 sound remake of the film, which was not directed by Browning, but instead by a director called Jack Conway. In addition to this, Harry, Daisy, and their sisters would also appear in several other films, mostly playing circus performers in titles that included That's My Baby, Baby Brother, and Three Ring Marriage. In between, they found work with the Ringling Brothers Circus and, of course, Barnum and Bailey as singers, horse wagon riders, and dancers, which they did from 1926 onwards, earning a considerable amount of fame. In the original story, Hans is described as arrogant, angry, and isolated, and one of the key changes in the film is that he is presented in a far more sympathetic light. He is kind, polite, and courteous, and not afraid to protect the woman he loves, even if that love is sadly very misdirected. Another key change is the introduction of a character called Frida, another performer in the Freak Show, and that role would be played by Harry's sister, Daisy. Frida is very much in love with Hans, creating a dramatic love triangle and also giving the film the opportunity to depict the performers in the Freak Show as complex characters with an emotional context. This is something that is very much missing from the original story and something that was very much Browning's intention. In the original story, the Freak Show performers are presented as arrogant and unpleasant, but in the film they are presented as a community. People who love, respect, and look out for each other. They are a close-knit group who, importantly for the plotline, have their own code of ethics. Offset against the monstrous characters of Cleopatra and her lover Hercules, the community of Freak Show performers are in fact the most admirable characters in the film. Although Browning had already made films with Lon Chaney playing various disabled characters, for Freaks, he wanted to use real talent from the vaudeville and carnival circuit. And so the casting director spent a month in New York and LA, selecting a cast which included Johnny Eckhart, whose stage name was Johnny Eck, and whose body ended below the ribcage. There was also Olga Roderick, who was a bearded lady, Cuckoo, who had progeria or premature aging, Pete Robinson, a 65-pound human skeleton, and Daisy and Violet Hilton, conjoined twins who had already made quite a name for themselves in vaudeville. Joining them was Prince Randian, a native of British Guyana who was missing both arms and legs, and Schlitzie, who had microcephaly and who was actually a man, but was often presented as a woman. Although in the film they are presented as a caring family, most notably in the scene where they are out lying in the sun, on the set it was in fact all rather different. Each of them had been a star on the vaudeville and carnival circuit, and their first film appearances and a move to California seemed to bring out rather diva-like behaviour. Johnny Eck would later comment that some of them, quote, started wearing sunglasses and acting all funny, end quote, and more than a few of them demonstrated some rather temperamental behaviour on set. Browning would later complain that he had to humour them as no Hollywood star had ever been humoured before, adding that, quote, their professional jealousy was amazing. None of them had a good word to say about the other, end quote. So, all in all, a very different atmosphere between them from that presented in the film. At the very least, there was certainly no mutual code of ethics. This code, which is central to the film, is referenced in the opening moments, which feature a sideshow Barker drawing in the crowds with no small amount of hyperbole. And again, please do bear in mind that what I am about to say is a direct quote from the film. Quote, we didn't lie to you, folks. We told you we had living, breathing monstrosities. You laugh at them, shudder at them, and yet, but for an accident of birth, you might be as they are. They did not ask to be born into this world, but into the world they came. Their code is a law unto themselves. Offend one, and you offend them all. And now, folks, if you'll just step this way, you are about to witness the most amazing, most astounding living monstrosity of all time. End quote. At this point, the Barker takes his crowd of followers to the edge of a pit. We do not see what or who is at the bottom, but it is enough to make at least one observer scream in horror. She was once a beautiful woman, continues the Barker. A royal prince shot himself for the love of her. She was known as the Peacock of the Air. At this point, the film flashes back, and we meet our chief antagonist, now not a bareback rider called Jean-Marie, but a trapeze artist called Cleopatra. She is played by Olga Baclanova, a Russian-born actress who appeared in numerous stage productions in her homeland before emigrating to the US in 1925. Here she began a film career, appearing in several silent movies, including the Conrad Veidt movie The Man Who Laughs in 1928. However, the advent of sound put paid to what was looking like a promising career as a leading lady. Her heavy Russian accent relegated her to smaller roles, and although she would continue to enjoy success on the stage, her film career was in decline when she was offered the role of Cleopatra. And this seems to be a real shame, as she attacks this role with both hands, delivering a fantastically cruel and heartless portrayal of a character who is possibly one of the most awful human beings ever to appear on screen. Well, until we get to our second movie this week anyway. We see this from her very first appearance, as she deliberately drops her cloak and patronisingly bends down to allow the love-struck hands to place it back around her shoulders. At this point, she doesn't know he has money, but she does suspect that he is very much smitten, and she also seems to be enjoying flirting with him purely to torment Frida, who is watching rather jealously from the side of the stage. She even takes this a step further, mocking Frida's costume and belittling her publicly before she rides into the circus ring. Like I said, she is an absolute monster, played with absolute perfection, and it's hard to believe that Baclanova wasn't the first choice for the role. But originally, the part was going to go to an up-and-coming starlet called Myrna Loy, who either pulled out or was pulled out at the last minute. From here, Cleopatra continues with her flirtations, as Hans begins to shower her with gifts, much to the dismay of Frida and the other performers in the freak show. "She isn't one of us," one of them whispers. "We're just filthy things to her." And indeed they are, or at least playthings to be toyed with and made fun of. And this includes one horrifyingly cruel moment where she tells Hans to massage her aching shoulders, all the while winking and grimacing at her colleagues who are watching and laughing nearby. All of this leads to a heartbreaking confrontation between she and Frida, where Frida begs her to stop the game she is playing and leave Hans alone. Sadly though, it is during this confrontation that Frida inadvertently reveals that Hans has come into a fortune, and Cleopatra begins to hatch a wicked plan. This again is a detour from the original story. In Spurs, Jean-Marie may marry Jacques for his money, but at least she doesn't plan to kill him, just to outlive him. She may be an opportunistic gold digger, but that's about as far as it goes. Here though, Cleopatra is even more heartless, deciding to marry and then slowly poison Hans, so that she can then enjoy his wealth with her lover, Hercules, the strongman. No longer called Simon Lafleur, which to my mind is a real shame, Hercules in the movie is also a far worse character than the one on the printed page, who doesn't really do much in the story, but follow along with Jean-Marie's plan and then offer to help her return to the circus when it all goes wrong. Here though, he is a much more active accomplice, and he also plots to murder another circus performer, a bareback rider called Venus, when she gets wise to their murderous plan. Hercules is played by Henry Victor, who had been born in England but raised in Germany, where he appeared in several silent movies, including the lead role in the 1916 version of The Picture of Dorian Gray. And here he gives a suitably trashy and arrogant performance. Even before he falls in with Cleopatra, we see exactly how he treats women when he is dumped by fellow performer Venus, who points out that he has been living off her money for the duration of their relationship. Doubtless, he'd refer to himself as an alpha male these days. Venus is depicted as a sympathetic character, comforting Frida about the state of her relationship with Hans and developing a relationship with Frozzo the Clown, who is played by comedy actor Wallace Ford. Venus is also incredibly strong-willed and single-minded, dumping Hercules and moving out of his caravan, and then confronting him about the murder plot in an attempt to bring it to an end. She was originally to have been played by platinum blonde Jean Harlow, but she also pulled out at the last minute and was replaced by contract player Leila Hyams. Hyams would later reflect that her first encounter with the freak show talent made her more than a little uncomfortable, though she would go on to say that, although her first reaction was one of great pity, she soon realised that absolutely none of them felt sorry for themselves at all, and so neither should she. The characters of Venus and Frozzo the Clown do not appear in the original story and are clearly there to contrast with the abhorrent behaviour of their counterparts Cleopatra and Hercules. Their love story also provides some lighter-hearted moments against the growing darkness of the narrative, though, to be fair, it does take a while for this darkness to fully come to fruition. What we actually have for the bulk of the film is a rather soapy slice of circus life, tinged with some romance and melodrama, and by the time the first 40 minutes have passed, you might begin to wonder whether you are watching a horror film at all. All of this changes, though, once Cleopatra and Hans get married. The wedding feast is possibly, apart from the climax, the most famous moment in the film, and it is a deeply uncomfortable watch. Not because of the physically different wedding guests, but because of Cleopatra and Hercules, who reveal their true colours in a fashion that is absolutely cringe-inducing. Again, this is a fantastic performance from Baclanova, who publicly kisses Hercules in front of her new husband, drunkenly mocks his pained reaction, and then watches with mounting fury as the wedding guests finally accept her, declaring her one of their community. They do this by performing a ritual called the loving cup, in which wine is poured into a goblet and passed around to each of the incredibly intoxicated guests as they drunkenly and happily chant, one of us, gooble gobble, we accept her, one of us." And even if you haven't seen the film, you may well have heard these lines before. They are used in the 2013 movie The Wolf of Wall Street, also an episode of South Park, and also in a song called Pinhead, written and performed by the Ramones, which was released in 1977. Needless to say, though, Cleopatra does not take kindly to this, and her reaction, goaded on by the equally drunken Hercules, and the growing intensity of the scene, explode into a climax when she throws the wine in their faces and screams, "Freaks! Freaks! Dirty, stinking freaks!" And then it somehow manages to become even worse. The guests all leave, and in a scene that is lifted from the story, Cleopatra lifts Hans onto her shoulders and carries him around as if he were a child, followed by Hercules, who mockingly plays an air trumpet. It is upsetting and horrifying, and if you hadn't already wanted to see her and her lover get their comeuppance, at this point you'll be shouting at the screen for someone to finish them both off. Several weeks now pass, and we learn that Hans is now bedridden, growing weaker by the day, though the doctor can find nothing wrong. Cleopatra is, of course, poisoning him, dripping what one assumes is arsenic from a brown bottle into his medicine, and insisting that he drink it all up for the good of his health. However, Hans' mysterious illness and Cleopatra's actions at the wedding have not gone unnoticed. Every time she leaves her caravan, she is watched from the shadows by Hans' co-workers, and we get the sense that the words we heard earlier about the code of conduct have more than an element of truth. Offend one, and you offend them all. And so, if you're anything like me, by this point you are practically rubbing your hands with glee. Fortunately, Hans is not the innocent victim that we might have assumed him to be. He is fully aware of Cleopatra's plans and has only been pretending to take his medicine. This all culminates in a showdown one night when the circus is leaving town and moving on in the middle of a thunderstorm. Cleopatra, preparing to give Hans what we assume to be his final dose, is surprised when she turns and finds him sitting up in bed, completely well. She is even more surprised when he demands to see the bottle, and several of his colleagues appear from various hiding places in the wagon. And while Hans seems only interested in the bottle itself, the others clearly have different things in mind. One of them flashes a switchblade, and the other begins brandishing a gun. Meanwhile, Hercules has decided that he needs to finish off Venus, and he attempts to clamber into her caravan while en route to silence her once and for all. At this point, rather fortuitously, some of the horses are scared by the storm, and Venus's caravan tips onto its side, opening the way for Frozzo the Clown to save her and fight Hercules off. And back in the other caravan, Cleopatra takes the accident as her opportunity to make a run for it, heading off into the darkness as Hans and his comrades chase after her through the woods. At the time of the film's release, this scene proved far too much for the critics and also some of the viewers, with the freak show performers making their way through the mud deemed far too disturbing. Though, to be honest, a fair amount of the preview audience actually didn't get this far. Halfway through the preview, members of the audience began to walk out, though more accurately half of them actually ran out. And later, a woman who attended tried to sue MGM, claiming that the experience had caused her to miscarry. And so Cleopatra and Hercules get their comeuppance, and we return to the opening scene of the movie and finally get to see what it was in the pit that so horrified an earlier spectator. And what we see is an image so bizarre that it stays with the viewer long after the film is over. Cleopatra, now legless, has somehow been transformed into a half-human, half-duck. Her face is horribly scarred, her torso covered in feathers. She can make no sound, save for a mangled quacking, as she waddles around her new home. And this, by the way, was the costume that Lon Chaney filmed in for the unreleased scenes in his last movie with Browning, West of Zanzibar. As for Hercules, unfortunately the modern viewer never discovers what happens to him, but as originally filmed and screened, it is made evidence that he has actually been castrated. He was to also have appeared in this final scene, singing in a castrato voice to indicate the vengeance that had been carried out. And fairly well deserved, I'd say. The reason that we don't get to see any of this harks back to the reaction of the preview audience and a devastating review from the Hollywood Reporter, which called the film repellent and announced that it left a dark brown taste, the implication being that watching the film was the equivalent of eating shit. It went on to say, quote, "Regardless of whatever box office future may be in store for MGM's Freaks, we are certain that, if the picture is released in its present form, it will send up a stench to the movie heavens, the effects of which will be felt wherever there are theatres, censorship, churches, and decency." End quote. The climax in particular drew the most criticism, with the review continuing, quote, "The beautiful trapeze artist has had her legs cut off and has lost her mind completely. The giant, once a basso profundo, gets the fade-out singing tenor." End quote. So clearly they didn't believe that Cleopatra and Hercules deserved their comeuppance. Don't know what film they were watching, but it can't have been the same one that I did. And of course, in fact, it wasn't, because after the disastrous preview and the reviews, MGM decided to cut Freaks from its running time of an hour and a half to just over an hour. And this is the version that we have today. Most crucially, what we lose is an extended version of what happens to Cleopatra and Hercules in the mud, including the castration of Hercules, but we also lose some other scenes as well. In addition, a new epilogue was added to the picture, designed to make Hans appear innocent in all the carnage, as Venus and Frozzo reunite him and Frida, and she comforts him with the words, "It wasn't your fault, Hans. You couldn't control them." But even this new epilogue and the greatly truncated running time couldn't save the movie. Freaks was pulled from circulation following its New York run, and Great Britain banned it altogether, something that would stay in effect for 30 years. In the 1960s, though, opinion of the film began to change, and it began to gain a cult following in Europe, and then soon after in the United States. Attitudes in the 1960s were, of course, very different from those of the 1930s. It's been suggested by the writer Kim Newman that part of this might be down to the reclamation of the word freak by the Love generation, taking on a far more positive connotation and becoming something to be celebrated rather than reviled. In addition, it was quite apparent to the new audiences that Browning's intention was to humanise his various sideshow performers, something that is clear from the community that is depicted in the film and the contrast with the two monsters in the movie. And these are, of course, Cleopatra and Hercules, who, despite their outward appearance of conventional beauty, are in fact rotten to the core. Next to Dracula, Freaks is now seen as Browning's greatest film. In fact, personally, I would venture to say that in its cinematography, script and characters, it is actually leagues ahead, though I am sure that some would disagree. By the time that Freaks was released, attitudes towards the freak show had begun to change, and it began to lose its popularity and its profitability. Critics began to argue that they were exploitative and abusive, and that they reinforced negative stereotypes about the differently bodied. Concerns about this led to many countries passing laws that either heavily regulated such shows or banned them outright, and the last major freak show in the US closed in 1956. Harry and Daisy Earles continued in show business for many years, and all four of the doll siblings appeared in The Wizard of Oz in 1939. Daisy also appeared in the film The Greatest Show on Earth in 1952. But with not many other film roles available, they returned to the circus, and they continued performing there along with the rest of their siblings, which they did until they retired in 1958. The decades with the circus had made the four siblings a good living, and they bought a house in Sarasota, Florida, where they all lived together for the rest of their lives. Gracie died in 1970, aged 71. Daisy died on March 15, 1980, at the age of 72. Harry died in 1985, at the age of 83. And the last surviving member of the family, Tiny, passed away in 2004, at the age of 90. Needless to say, the backlash and the banning of Freaks did not bode well for Tod Browning, and it marked the beginning of a slow decline. His follow-up film, Fast Workers, was another box office disaster, and he would only make another 3 features. Ironically though, 2 of these are in fact rather good, and they are films that I return to often. In 1935, he effectively remade London After Midnight as Mark of the Vampire, starring Bela Lugosi and Lionel Barrymore. It's a little bit hokey, Barrymore is riotously over the top, and the male lead is a little annoying, but it is good fun nonetheless. A year later, Barrymore and Browning reunited again for The Devil Doll, which follows an escapee from Devil's Island who carries out a bizarre revenge on those who framed him for bank robbery and murder. If nothing else, the sight of Barrymore in disguise as a kindly old lady, a reference to Lon Chaney in The Unholy Three, is probably worth the price of admission alone. Tod Browning's final film was Miracles for Sale, released in 1939, 3 years after The Devil Doll. A locked room mystery that revisited his recurring themes of fakery, spiritualism and magic, it was critically well received, but failed dismally at the box office. As a result, Browning was dismissed from his contract at MGM and was, by his own account, blackballed as a filmmaker. Alice Browning died from complications of pneumonia in 1944, following which Tod became a recluse, living in alcoholic isolation for almost 20 years. In 1962, he was diagnosed with cancer of the larynx, and a surgical procedure designed to remove the tumour rendered him mute. He died alone at his home in Malibu on October 6, 1962. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is Santa Sangre from 1989, directed by Alejandro Jodorowsky. This stars Axel Jodorowsky, Adan Jodorowsky, Blanca Guerra, Thelma Tixou, and Guy Stockwell. Alejandro Jodorowsky is an incredibly polarizing figure whose films are laden with metaphors about religious and political oppression, mysticism, poetic imagery, and extreme violence. Some call him talented to the point of madness and a visionary, while others call him pretentious and a charlatan. Now 97 years old, across his life he has been a writer, mime artist, mystic, theatre director, film director, cartoonist, and extremely controversial, both in his work and also in some of his pronouncements. Do I like all of his films? If I'm honest, no, not really, but that's probably because I don't always understand them. But in 1989, he did release a film called Santa Sangre, which is the only horror film he ever directed, and was in fact the first of his films that I ever saw. It is, of course, a film that I like very much, and it's also his most accessible work. But before we get into the movie, I think I should probably give some context and provide a very, very condensed history of the director himself. He was born in February 1929 in Iquique, Chile, to immigrant Russian parents, and he had a very difficult childhood. According to his 2005 autobiography, he was conceived through sexual violence, and his father, a former circus worker, was physically and psychologically abusive. Life in the port town of Iquique was hard and unpredictable, and as the son of immigrants, he was seen as an outsider. Something that would have been compounded even further by the fact that he was Jewish, had he even known that himself. Quote, "My father hid that he was Jewish. He never signed his full name. He disguised himself as a Russian, and he never told me that I was Jewish until it became clear to me around the age of 13 or 14, when I started being bullied at school." Chile at that time was split, half in favour of the Allies and half in favour of the Nazis. I never had a Jewish education or a history and never celebrated the holidays. My father hid all of that from me. I always felt an absence of nationality and never had something of my own, a place that belonged to me. End quote. Surrounded by poverty and violence, he escaped into literature, claiming that he began to read at the age of 5, starting off with children's adaptations of classics, including the Odyssey and the works of William Shakespeare. When he was 13 years old, his family moved to Santiago, and it was here that he began to explore other creative avenues, becoming fascinated by mime, the circus and puppetry, appearing professionally as a clown. He also became fascinated by the cinema, which he described as the only friend that he truly had. And it was through the local movie house that he was introduced to the worlds of fantasy and horror, particularly James Whale's Frankenstein, which he has described as being his personal Hamlet, and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. While at university in Santiago, he began directing theatre and also began to study mime, which he has called theatre without any text, a term which could be applied to many of his later films. He left Chile in 1953 and travelled to Europe, arriving first in Barcelona and then moving onwards to Paris, where, according to him at least, he tried to make contact with the surrealist André Breton. And now we come to something rather challenging about Jodorowsky, as much like Tod Browning before him, he has what I can only call a fleeting acquaintance with the absolute truth. According to Jodorowsky, he called Breton at 1 a.m. and insisted upon an immediate meeting, telling him that he had come to Paris to revive surrealism. Unsurprisingly, Breton suggested the next day instead, at which point Jodorowsky claimed to have said, "Well, it's not very surrealist of you to not see me," and then hung up the phone and never contacted him again. What we can say for certain, though, is that he began studying mime, through which he formed an acquaintance with the famous mime artist Marcel Marceau, joining Marceau's mime company in 1954 and remaining there until the end of the 1950s. As part of the company, he toured the world, but he also worked for 2 years as a stage director at the Alhambra Theatre in Paris, and then also for a further year at the Trois Bidets Theatre, also in Paris. In 1957, he made his first movie, a short film titled La Cravate, or The Tie, which was based on a story by the writer Thomas Mann. This was a 20-minute colour short film about, in his own words, quote, "a girl who sells heads, She changes the heads of a poetical guy and a boxer. She puts the spiritual head on the strong body and the idiot head on the spiritual body, and each head then changes his body. I am saying that you are not a body who has spirit, you are a spirit who has a body. End quote. His life in Paris led him to the writings of Antonin Artaud, a playwright, poet, madman, and the originator of the theatre of cruelty. This is a theatrical movement which proposes that theatre should be a return to magic and ritual, a language of space devoid of all dialogue that should overwhelm all of the senses. And it is quite clear that this philosophy had a major impact on him, as elements of Artaud's principles, particularly violent images and sensory overload, can be found throughout Jodorowsky's work. In 1962, he took these principles to the stage when he co-founded the Panic Movement Company, which attacked the audience with noise, colour, and once again, sensory overload. Their ambition, he said, was to, quote, do shows that would never be repeated. This increased my possibilities of expression considerably. We would use gelatin, rotten food, massive structures, lots of things. End quote. To give you an idea, one of their performances was a 4-hour-long happening staged at the 1965 Paris Festival of Free Expression. This performance involved live snakes, naked women covered in honey, and Jodorowsky being stripped and then dressed in 20 pounds of beefsteak sewn together, 40 years before Lady Gaga's meat dress was hailed as original and transgressive. Unfortunately, it also included geese having their throats slit, and this would not be the last time that an animal would be made to suffer for Jodorowsky's art. In 1960, he left Paris and he moved to Mexico City, where he directed over 100 plays, established a Surrealist review, and began writing a weekly cartoon called Panic Fables, which was published in a national newspaper for 200 weeks. By 1966, he had become a very well-known, if not infamous, cartoonist and theatre director, and he returned to Paris, where he staged a production of a play called Fando Elise, an absurdist and surrealist play by the writer Fernando Arrabal. The show ran for a year, after which Jodorowsky approached Arrabal to see if he could turn it into a film, and this became his debut feature, which he released in 1968. The story follows its titular characters, Fando and Lise, through a barren post-apocalyptic wasteland in search of the mythical city of Tar, where they hope to find enlightenment. But although he took the play's title and basic story as his foundation, he also filled the screen with incredibly surreal and violent imagery, once again inspired by the philosophies of Antonin Artaud, to name just one influence. Featuring excessive violence and brutality, some of which was not staged but actually shot for real, it took 2 years to film and premiered as Mexico's entry in the Acapulco Film Festival. And here it caused a sensation, though far from in a positive way. Shown to an audience of 2,500 people, by the end of the first hour, fights had broken out, people were storming from the auditorium, and Jodorowsky had to escape through the back of the venue and flee in a waiting limousine as people began to throw rocks at the car. Mexican director Emilio Fernandez apparently threatened to kill him, and other Mexican directors were outraged that this was the film chosen to represent their country. It opened in Mexico City the following week, but after equally outraged and aggressive responses to the on-screen violence and the surrealism, it was pulled from theatres and banned altogether. His next film, El Topo, in which he played the lead, was released in 1970 and is a western, kind of, that he infused with his growing interest in mysticism, Buddhism, meditation, and the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, to name just a few. It also included multiple religious motifs that would become a mainstay in many of his films, particularly, of course, in Santa Sangre. Much like Fando Elise, this film is about the quest for enlightenment, and much like Fando Elise, it is also extraordinarily bloody, surreal, and violent. Turned down by the major distributors, who really didn't know how to market it, it was originally screened in New York at the Museum of Modern Art, where it was seen by a man called Ben Barenholtz, who owned the Elgin Cinema in Chelsea. Barenholtz arranged a deal to screen the film in a limited run of weekly midnight screenings at the Elgin, and although it was barely advertised, word of mouth soon began to spread. Opening in December 1970, by January 1971 it was doing record business, and it earned the recommendation of John Lennon and Yoko Ono, with screenings turning into weed-infused happenings. It played at the Elgin every night until June 1971, and then the distribution rights were bought by Lennon's manager, Alan Klein, who moved the film from Chelsea to Broadway. Needless to say, the underground crowd considered Jodorowsky to have sold out. But that's what happens when you start hanging out with John Lennon. He followed this with The Holy Mountain in 1973, a film heavily based on a surrealist novel by a writer called René Dumas. This is once again about the quest for enlightenment, as a group of explorers follow their charismatic cult leader, played by Jodorowsky again, on a journey to the mystical mountain of the title. Much like El Topo, this film is also infused with the director's multiple spiritual predilections, which by now included the tarot, yoga, the I Ching, and the Kabbalah. John Lennon and George Harrison of the Beatles were both reportedly interested in appearing in it, but Lennon decided he didn't want to leave Yoko to spend 3 months in Mexico, and Harrison eventually turned it down because of the requirement for male nudity. A visually stunning, but if I'm honest, bloody confusing and at times frustrating film, it premiered out of competition at Cannes in 1973, but was pretty much ignored by the press. It then opened in New York City on November the 29th, where, much like its predecessor, it played midnight screenings at the Art House Movie Theatre, the Waverley, every Friday and Saturday for 16 months. It ran at other midnight screenings until 1975, and then it disappeared for 30 years, with the occasional bootleg copy only adding to the film's mythical and cult status. His next project was supposed to be an adaptation of the Frank Herbert novel Dune, which he began adapting in 1974. Supposed to feature Salvador Dali, Orson Welles, Charlotte Rampling, and Gloria Swanson, with designs by H.R. Giger and music by Pink Floyd. A year after the film was announced, the American financiers suddenly pulled out, and Jodorowsky's Dune has gone on to become the mythical film that never was. In 1980, he released a film called Tusk, which marked a significant departure. It's a children's film for a start, based on a children's story called Pooh Lawn of the Elephants. Jodorowsky's intention was to use the story setting of the British Empire as a metaphor for the Spanish conquest of his adopted homeland, Mexico, but the film was not a success commercially, critically, or personally. Jodorowsky himself laid the blame for this on his producer, Eric Rochat, saying, quote, "For me, Tusk is a film as valuable as El Topo, only it is for children. What we have seen so far is an incomplete cut. But the producer, a crook, declared bankruptcy, got the money in his pocket and fled, leaving the installation unfinished. I am still, to this day, fighting for the rights and the final cut, remastering and resubmission." End quote. Taking a break from filmmaking after this, he continued his mystical and spiritual explorations, setting up a series of weekly lectures in Paris, exploring psychoanalysis through tarot divination. He also continued creating comics and graphic novels, including the series Incal, which was published in installments between 1980 and 1988. And so, for 9 years, the man who had shocked the world with his transgressive, subversive, violent, and highly controversial films didn't release another movie. But this all changed in 1989 with the second of this week's films, Santa Sangre. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so all the usual warnings apply from this point forward. Santa Sangre has 2 origin stories, separate tales that intertwined during pre-production to produce the surrealist horror masterpiece, and I use that word advisedly, that we see today. The first is a story from Jodorowsky himself, and harks back to the days when he was writing the comic strip Panic Fables, which was incredibly popular and read by millions in Mexico each week. One day, after delivering his latest installment, he stopped at a nearby coffee house, where he was approached by a man who told him that he was an admirer of his work, and who asked if he could sit with him. Jodorowsky agreed, and the man introduced himself. His name was Gregorio Cardenas Hernandez, but he had also been known by another name, the Tacuba Strangler, and he had been a serial killer. In Jodorowsky's recollections, he claims to have been immediately fascinated that he was sitting and talking with a man who had killed 17 women, but in fact Hernandez actually killed only 4. Still 4 too many, of course, but this is what I mean about the director's tendency towards exaggeration and hyperbole. Over a 3-week period in 1952, Hernandez killed 2 16-year-olds, a 14-year-old, and a 19-year-old girl, and buried their remains in his back garden. The father of his latest victim, Graciela alias Avalos, reported her missing on September 3rd, 1942, a day after her murder. Following her tracks, the police found Hernandez, or more specifically, they found the bodies buried in his back garden. He had already been committed to an asylum the night before by his mother, who claimed that he had gone completely insane. The case was the first serial killer story to gain widespread attention in the Mexican media, and it became a sensation. Hernandez pled guilty at his trial and was given a life sentence, but rather depressingly, he also became something of a celebrity. He escaped from prison in 1947, but was eventually rearrested, and he remained in prison until 1976. While there, he was regularly questioned by the country's top psychiatrists and criminologists. He published 3 books, and he studied psychiatry and law himself. In 1976, after 34 years in prison, he was considered rehabilitated, and at 62 years old, he was also no longer considered a danger. He was released, and in 1984 enrolled at the National Autonomous University of Mexico to study law, from which he graduated in 1985. Needless to say, Jodorowsky was fascinated, and he alleges that the following conversation took place. Quote, "I asked him why he did it. He said, because I was crazy. They put me in a mental hospital for years, and now I'm fine. I forgot everything. I got married, I became a lawyer, I have some daughters. I'm a good family man. I write articles, I also write novels. I'm a writer. That's it, that's my story. I'm a good guy because I was granted redemption by God." End quote. And, again, according to Jodorowsky, at that moment he was struck by the idea of redemption, asking himself, how can a murderer, through different psychological or magic ways, forget his crimes and have a nice life? So, that's Jodorowsky's story, or at least one version of the story that he told in a documentary called Forget Everything You Have Ever Seen, The World of Santa Sangre. Being blunt, none of the dates particularly line up, and it all seems remarkably fortuitous, but that's the story he likes to tell. Like I say, he is prone to some exaggeration and myth-building, so whether you want to believe in it entirely is completely down to you. So, that's origin story number 1, and now we move on to origin story number 2. A few years earlier, over in Italy, a young man called Roberto Leoni, who would go on to write numerous Italian movies and TV shows, was at university, working in the library, which was also part of a therapy program for psychiatric patients. And, while doing so, he had an experience that stayed with him for many years. Quote, "One of these patients, who worked with me because he knew 3 or 4 languages, so he could help me sort the books, one day started looking sideways and saying, 'Shut up, shut up.' The 3rd time I asked him what happened, and he answered me calmly with his calm blue eyes. 'Nothing. I have a voice that tells me to kill you, but don't worry because I love you. I was a little uncomfortable, but he reassured me, no, don't worry. I love you. I don't listen to it, continuing to stare at me with his blue eyes. I was, as far as I could be, calm. The library was very extensive because there were 5 very large rooms for the 50,000 volumes, and it was me and him alone, isolated on a high floor of this immense palace. And I trusted. I trusted his blue eyes, I trusted him, and his sincere way of telling me, I love you. End quote. This experience, quite understandably, stayed with him, and it became the basis for a screenplay that he would later begin to write, one in which, quote, even the worst demon actually can't forget that he is an angel, end quote. And at some point, he began discussing it with the Italian film producer and younger brother of Dario, Claudio Argento. And this is where it all gets a little bit messy, depending on which accounts you want to believe. Looking at various sources, it would appear that both Leone and Argento worked on the screenplay together, with the latter saying, quote, I've always contributed ideas to the films I'd worked on up till then, but Santa Sangre was the first film for which I actually sat down in front of a typewriter. Although much of the plot was my idea, I think we all deserve credit. End quote. Leone himself agreed with this perspective, well, to an extent, and both also agree that once the screenplay was finished, they sought out the best director they could think of for the project. Having already produced several of his elder brother's films in Italy, Claudio, who would serve as a producer on Santa Sangre, was looking for a different director to work with, and this was how the project came to Jodorowsky via his agent. Jodorowsky read the screenplay and then asked to meet up with Leone in Paris, as he wanted to meet the man who wrote the story. And here, Leone picks up the tale. Quote, the first thing that he asked me was, when did you write this story? About a year ago, I said. When exactly? I don't remember. Then I remembered that my daughter had a fever and I was telling her stories. And then I went to my study and an idea occurred to me and I started to throw that one down, which was the first nucleus of Santa Sangre. Then I said, it should have been around March the 29th. What time did you write it? At about 1:30 or 2 in the morning. Ah, I knew it. That night I went to sleep early, and the angel of stories passed over Paris to bring me a story, saw that I slept and continued to roam, saw that you were awake and gave you the story. But the story was mine, and you are a thief. End quote. Like I say, Jodorowsky, master of hyperbole. Jodorowsky came on board with the project, and there is absolutely no doubt that he took the original screenplay and infused it with his own perspective, themes, and passions. How far this went from the original is really anybody's guess. All 3 are credited with the final screenplay, but the director has claimed that Leone and Argento's contributions were merely secretarial, and that they typed up his thoughts and suggestions, and that, other than that, they did nothing. As with all such things, I suspect the reality lies somewhere in between. As I mentioned, the film is probably the most coherent of Jodorowsky's movies, and this does suggest the influence of an outside hand, but what is within the framework of the narrative is most certainly all his. The film opens in an asylum where a young man, Phoenix, sits atop a wooden perch and has to be tempted down by the clinical staff. Phoenix, mute and haunted, appears possessed by the spirit of an eagle, or at least believes himself to be one. Encouraged down from his perch by a raw fish, as we draw closer to his face, we are suddenly given a bird's-eye perspective, as his spirit flies back through time and takes us into his childhood. We, or rather the bird, fly over the rooftops of Mexico City, finally coming to rest at some point in the past. And there, in the middle of the main square, is a big top belonging to the Circo del Gringo, or the Circus of Americans. One of the outstanding things about Santa Sangre is the way in which it blends the real with the surreal and the ordinary with the extraordinary. The square in which the big top stands is real, as is almost every other location for the film, despite the fact that at points they are lit and filmed to appear almost artificial. And this reality extends to the church that we see at the edge of that town square, outside which sex workers wander up and down until a client offers them money and they take them to complete their transaction. Jodorowsky has said that this was known locally as the Church of the Prostitutes, and that the girls would get $1, the pimp another, and a third would go to the priest. And this, of course, highlights one of the central themes of the film, the corruption of religion, which, it is implied, leads to insanity and death. Outside the big top, we see a procession of circus performers, all played by genuine circus artists, save one or two, most notably the young Phoenix, who appears riding an elephant. And if one is struck by the similarity between the actors playing Phoenix in the asylum and the Phoenix of the past, it is because they are brothers, respectively Axel and Adan Jodorowsky, the director's sons. And indeed, Santa Sangre was very much a family affair. The film also features Tod Browning as the trilby-wearing pimp, and Brontis Jodorowsky in a small role as a hospital orderly. Very sadly, Teo would die not long after filming, making the movie a very painful one for his director father and for his brothers to watch. In fact, Jodorowsky has said that he was unable to return to it for many, many years. Young Phoenix goes to a car that is parked beside the big top. In it sleeps his father, Orgo, who is dressed in a cowboy hat and very gaudy tassels. He is the owner of the circus, whose nationality, costume, and business provide the key to another central theme of the movie. This is the oppression of different cultures, most notably that of Mexico by America. The circus is, after all, called the Circus of Gringos, and it feels very much like America has landed in the center of town. Orgo is an American, and he wears a gaudy Stars and Stripes uniform, cowboy hat, and boots. He's also played by an American actor, Guy Stockwell, in a deliberate choice to underscore the idea of invasion and oppression from outside forces. We soon discover that the reason he had to leave the US and settle in Mexico was because he killed a woman back in the States. And Jodorowsky has said that if you watch the film more than once, you may start to realise that he is actually a serial killer himself. Now he has come to Mexico, ostensibly to hide out, but also potentially to continue with his crimes. Unfortunately, Guy Stockwell, who was the brother of the far more famous actor Dean, proved difficult once he arrived on set. Jodorowsky has described this as being in direct contrast to when he first met him to discuss the project. Quote, "Like all actors, when I went to LA, he was wonderful. He admired me, he was sweet, he was obedient. Once he signed the contract and we shot the first scene, he became a monster, just like every other star. The stars would love to be the director of the movie, the center of everything. And he was like that." End quote. Part of this is possibly down to an alcohol dependency, and he would sometimes be intoxicated on set. At one point, for his naked death scene, this was encouraged by Jodorowsky, who gave him a bottle of mezcal to get through it, but on other occasions, probably not so much. Nevertheless, his most frequent co-star, Thelma Tixou, who plays the monstrously evil tattooed woman, remembers him as being a perfect gentleman for all of their scenes together. And it is the tattooed woman that we meet next, who is clearly trying to give Cleopatra from Freaks a run for her money in the Malevolent Stakes. She is training a young girl, Alma, a deaf-mute preteen, to learn a tightrope act, and things are really not going well. Now, given that the girl is being asked to walk across a burning tightrope, it's probably not that surprising. But the tattooed woman is not sympathetic, shouting that she should have left the girl in the poorhouse when her mother died. Fortunately, at that moment, the lady is distracted by Orgo, and so begins a seduction routine that involves contortion, backbending, and knife throwing, all while the circus clowns stare on. As mentioned, she is played by Thelma Tixou, a former model and showgirl who stood 6'1" in heels and who is here making her screen debut. It's an incredibly assured performance, cruel and animalistic, and she only gets more horrible as a character as the film progresses. Much like with Cleopatra, she is very much a character that you love to hate, and it comes as a great relief when she also gives us the most brutal death scene in the movie, though more on that a little bit later. From here, we suddenly shift to the Church of Santa Sangre, or the Church of the Holy Blood, where Phoenix's mother, Concha, is holding a line against developers and riot police in order to protect her church. And she does this even if it means giving her life. She doesn't seem too interested in the impact that this might have on Phoenix, who has arrived to watch the commotion, and instead is far more impressed by the Catholic Monsignor, who arrives in a limousine to visit the church. Once inside, we are presented with what appears to be a giant swimming pool filled with blood, and the story of the supposed saint and martyr of the Church of Santa Sangre. This is St. Lirio, a young girl who was attacked, had her arms cut off and was raped, and who was then left to die in the dirt. According to Concha, where the girl died, her blood remained, and this is where they built their church. The pool of blood is now considered sacred. The Monsignor dips his hand into the pool of supposed holy blood and declares it to be paint, also declaring that the church is no more than a blasphemy and a monstrosity in the eyes of the Lord. And as he leaves, he insists that the bulldozers move in to tear it down. Concha almost sacrifices herself in an attempt to stop the destruction, and is only saved at the last minute by the desperate pleas of her son, Phoenix. Concha and Phoenix walk dejectedly home, saying nothing, followed by an accompaniment of clowns. When they arrive at the circus, Concha sees Orgo being far too close with the tattooed woman and flies into a rage, only to be at first hypnotized by him and then carried off. She and her husband have sex, and this is something that is watched in secret by the young Phoenix. Meanwhile, one of the elephants from the circus lies dying on the steps outside the big top, its trunk spurting blood. This, juxtaposed with Phoenix watching his parents have sex, is perhaps a rather obvious sexual metaphor, and it represents the loss of childhood innocence. But for Jodorowsky, the death of the elephant represents far more than just that. He has said that the elephant is a symbol of a fallen god, a god on his knees and powerless as his world comes to an end. There is also a parallel between the death of the elephant, lying on the steps in a pool of blood, and the death of St. Lirio, of whom we heard earlier, and who died as a result of sexual violence, also in a pool of blood. So, regular listeners by now will have begun to appreciate why I love this film so much, and that is because it is an absolute visual feast. The use of colour is unbelievably impactful, not least because in most cases it appears almost organic, as opposed to the colour washes and lighting gels of the Italian giallo. Not that there's anything wrong with them either. But so far in this film we have had the bright white of the asylum, the gaudiness of the circus, the deep red of the worshippers standing in protest outside the Santa Sangre church, the interior of the church itself with its gigantic pool of blood, the green clothing of musicians who follow Phoenix and Concha down the street, and, coming up now, what is probably my favourite scene in the movie, the funeral of the elephant. Led by Olga, who carries a black and white stars and stripes, the circus performers, all dressed in black, make their way through the streets, the elephant's body housed in a small skip-sized coffin. They eventually reach a chasm at the end of a rubbish-filled wasteland. The inhabitants of a shantytown on the other side, smeared in white dust in contrast with the black of the funeral procession, come to watch. Suddenly, the elephant's coffin is slid down a chute and into a pit below, and the people from the shantytown run to tear it apart, breaking it open with crowbars to get at the elephant meat inside. If the elephant was a god then, this could be seen as an act of communion, But it also suggests that one man's God is just another man's dinner, and that maybe religion, and all of the tradition around it, really has no meaning at all. Phoenix is understandably heartbroken by the death of the elephant and reduced to tears by the funeral. And seeing this, Orgo decides to make a man out of his young son by tattooing his chest with the image of a phoenix, the very same image that Orgo has tattooed on his own chest. He does this at great length and with great pain by using one of his throwing knives. So this scene then represents the boy's painful ascent into manhood, for Orgo at least. But what we see is a young child being physically abused by his father. It's a horrible sequence, not least because of the young actor's performance, though some of the reaction was achieved by the director father sitting beneath the chair and pinching him hard on the legs until he cried. And so, in this scene, we have an actor playing a character who is being abused physically by his father, and in order to do so, he is being physically hurt by his director father. Too many levels there to even begin to unpack. We now come to the end of Act 1 and the finale of our flashback sequence. Orgo, drunk once again, is having sex with the tattooed woman, not knowing that they are being spied on by Concha. And she, once again, demonstrating the instability that we saw in her earlier behaviour at the church, and indeed when she first returned to the circus, grabs a bottle of acid and douses it all over his crotch, chemically castrating him in a quite literal sense. In a fit of rage, he pins Concha to his knife-throwing board and in one swift movement chops off both of her arms, an echo of the story of St. Lirio, and effectively making his wife a martyr to her own saint. Orgo then stumbles into the street and cuts his own throat. Locked in his trailer, young Phoenix can only watch helplessly as his father dies in a pool of blood, which is sniffed at and then eaten by a group of stray dogs. To make matters even worse, the tattooed woman immediately drives away with young Alma, who stares out of the back of the car, crying silently for Phoenix as he stares, crying, as she fades into the night. So far then, we have had America in the center of Mexico, a church being used as a front for sex work, violent oppression in the name of progress, the Catholic Church arriving in a limousine and announcing folk religion, a religion that has become an obsession, the loss of innocence, the death of a god, a suggestion that there is no such thing as paradise, only consumption of the body, child abuse, martyrdom, and family trauma. And this is without even mentioning the double meanings of the characters' names. Phoenix is, of course, the Spanish for phoenix, who rises from the fire and the ashes to be reborn. Alma, the name of the young girl in the circus with whom Phoenix is in love, means soul. Orgo is a reference to orgasm, and Concha means shell, but it's also Chilean slang for part of the female anatomy. All of this is within the first 40 minutes, and we could probably spend a good hour or so unpacking it and still have plenty of threads at which to pull. So given that we've already been here for nearly 2 hours, you will be happy to hear that I'm not going to do that, and nor am I going to attempt to run through the rest of the film. What I really wanted to focus on today was mostly that opening 40 minutes, because what that does is set up the overarching theme for everything that follows. This theme is something that was outlined by producer Claudio Argento in an interview given in the book Spaghetti Nightmares. I'm just going to read you an extract, and you should probably be aware that the killer to whom he is referring in this extract is Gregorio Hernandez, and much like his colleague Jodorowsky, there's more than a little here that is factually inaccurate. Quote, "It's a reflection on the roots of social crime. According to Jodorowsky and myself, there is no such thing as a criminal. Evil is always instigated by a corrupt society and the family, which influence an individual through his entire life. In Santa Sangre, the family has an obviously negative effect, as is shown by the true story that took place in Mexico on which the film is based. A Mexican became a slave to the evil presence of his mother, who incited him to kill the women he met, and in the end he committed as many as 20 murders. After 10 years spent in an asylum for the criminally insane, the man frees himself from this evil presence, his mother having died, and went back to being perfectly normal. He married, had children, and currently works as a journalist. Alejandro met him in a bar and was fascinated by his story. The film shows that everyone can be redeemed. Even the most evil demon cannot forget that he was once an angel. End quote. So there you go. If it's not one thing, it's your mother. And this is, of course, what happens in the rest of the movie. We return to Phoenix in the asylum, who is taken on an evening trip, ostensibly to the cinema with the rest of the patients, but which turns into something rather different. Abandoned physically and emotionally by the people supposed to be escorting them, Phoenix and the patients are waylaid by a pimp and are instead taken to see a sex worker. And before this, they are also offered cocaine in a scene which seems like a bastardization of Holy Communion. Unfortunately for everybody, this trip to the rough side of town reintroduces Phoenix to the tattooed woman and awakens within him something that has lain dormant for decades. He reunites with his mother and becomes her arms in a cabaret act, but sadly he becomes her arms for much more than this as well. What follows is a battle of wills between mother and son that is beautifully played by both Axel Jodorowsky's stunning talents at mime and Blanca Guerra's icy cold depiction of Concha. And so the two come together in a very bizarre power dynamic that more than hints at incest, while also referencing sexual politics and the corrosive nature of the family unit. For Jodorowsky, this was incredibly personal. Not only were all four of his sons in the picture, but it was also an opportunity to explore his own demons, and notably the relationship he had with his own mother. Quote, "I was putting a lot of myself into the film. All my life I felt my mother was a castrate woman by my father, and she wanted to live her life through me. I was also a killer, a psychological killer, a misogynist, destroying women. I was not able to love." End quote. I can't really leave, though, without mentioning the tattooed woman's murder, which is, to my mind, one of the greatest death scenes in 1980s horror. Beginning with a subjective viewpoint and ending in a welter of blood, much like what happens to Cleopatra, her demise is thoroughly deserved. And as well as giving an enormous amount of satisfaction, it also gives us a giallo-esque murder that out-Argento's Dario. And that's something I never thought I'd say. Rather strangely, though, it did cause no end of concern for his brother Claudio, who was worried it was a little too over the top. Quote, "I was afraid we might run into trouble with the censors, so I asked Alejandro to make it a little bit less brutal. But he insisted, no, it's his obsession. He has to tear her to pieces in order to eradicate the problem. So, in the end, I let him do as he pleased." End quote. Jodorowsky himself, however, sees the murder as beautiful, saying, quote, "It is art. It is not real. It is fake. Nobody is dying. I laugh when I see that. Claudio Argento wanted a character who kills a lot of women. I make one murder, and that is all." End quote. To be fair, there is more than one murder in the second half of the film, but we'll let it slide. Filmed on location in Mexico City with very few interiors shot in the studio, the production, originally scheduled to film for 10 weeks, ran over into 12. More significantly, they ran out of money after only 3 weeks, and rescue funding had to be brought in from Japanese backers. Given what we see on the screen, this is perhaps not surprising. The film is set piece after set piece after set piece. From the destruction of the Chapel of Santa Sangre, the elephant funeral, the Day of the Dead skeletons littering the street after the first murder, and the messianic hallucinations adult Phoenix experiences, it may well be the most coherent of Jodorowsky's movies, but it still overwhelms the senses at every turn. And this visual experience is greatly enhanced by an excellent score from Simon Boswell, who we spoke about a few weeks ago when we talked about his work on the Italian movie Stage Fright. Combining electronic horror pastiche with folk music and barrel organs, his score perfectly captures the fracturing nature of Phoenix's psyche and is a perfect accompaniment to the beautiful insanity that we see on screen. Santa Sangre premiered at the 42nd Cannes Film Festival in 1989 and received widespread praise. Roger Ebert said that he believed the film carried the moral message of genuinely opposing evil, rather than celebrating it, saying, quote, "After waiting patiently through countless dead teenager movies, I am reminded by Alejandro Jodorowsky that true psychic horror is possible on the screen. Horror, poetry, surrealism, psychological pain, and wicked humour all at once." On the festival circuit, it was nominated for multiple honours and won a jury prize at the Moscow Interfest, as well as awards at the 1991 Saturn Awards for Adan Jodorowsky and Best Film at the Fantasy Film Festivals in both Paris and Madrid. Surprisingly, on its UK release, it slipped through the censors uncut, but sadly the same cannot be said for the American release, where the death of the elephant and, of course, the killing of the tattooed woman ended up being heavily censored. Jodorowsky was typically hyperbolic about this, calling the decisions idiocy and saying, quote, "I want bad taste, a violent crime with Mexican dancing music and more blood, more, a fantastic crime." End quote. Santa Sangre was far more successful financially than Jodorowsky's earlier movies, and made him a more financially viable option to investors and producers. And so, as a result, in 1990, he directed a fantasy drama called The Rainbow Thief, which starred Omar Sharif, Peter O'Toole, and a brief cameo from Christopher Lee. Sadly, this was not a happy experience. His relationship with Peter O'Toole was particularly difficult, something that he lays firmly at the actor's door. Quote, "This star comes in and makes a big crisis of anything in order to show that they are the master and the director is a shit. I am the master, be careful with me. He was a person impossible. You cannot speak with that star. He was too in the sky. You can't direct a person like that. He doesn't learn his lines, you need cue cards. A person who doesn't see you, doesn't speak to you, doesn't say hello to you. Terrible. It's terrible. I hate him. I still hate him. He is the only person in all my life I hated. The only one." End quote. So this might go some way towards explaining the lengthy gap between this and his following films. In 2013, he released a semi-autobiographical musical fantasy called The Dance of Reality, which he followed with its sequel, Endless Poetry, released in 2016. In 2019, he released a documentary film called Psychomagic, A Healing Art, which detailed his unique approach to therapy and trauma. Now aged 94 years old, as of the time of recording, Jodorowsky still has an upcoming project up his sleeve, this time as a writer. This is a film based on his graphic novel series, The Incal, and it's currently in production, directed by Taika Waititi. Freaks and Santa Sangre are both films set in circus environments, and it's impossible to watch the second without seeing some of the influence of the first film deep within. There are, of course, parallels between the evil Cleopatra and the tattooed lady, but more than that, both films show a real respect for circus life and the more marginalised employees within. Jodorowsky has gone on record as being a huge admirer of Tod Browning's work, saying that he sees him very much as a father figure, that Freaks was certainly an influence, and he's even joked that he may be Tod Browning reincarnated. And based on these two films, their circus backgrounds, their desire to shock, and their shared propensity for exaggeration and myth-building, I have to say, really wouldn't be entirely surprised. Next week, we are on the hunt for a killer with a double bill from two masters of suspense and film noir. First up, we return to Germany for M from 1931 and director Fritz Lang, This stars Peter Lorre, Otto Wernicke, Inga Langert and Theodore Luce. Then we follow this with Frenzy from 1972 and director Alfred Hitchcock. This stars John Finch, Barry Foster, Bernard Cribbins and Barbara Lee Hunt. If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please also consider sharing it with any horror-loving friends. As always, you can write to the show at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow our Instagram at thehorrordouble. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.